Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to today's Transport Planning Society webinar. My name is Ben Plowden. I'm chair of the Transport Planning Society. I'm also an associate in the transport team at PA Consulting and a visiting professor at the Centre for Transport Studies at UCL. So obviously have a background in transport in a number of ways. It's my huge pleasure to be chairing today's event. Which, as you all know from the publicity, is called The Mood of the Nation, Transport Insights from Ipsos UK. And I'd love to be able to pretend that we knew that Rishi Sunak was going to announce the election last week when we planned this event, because it's perfectly timed in that sense. But unfortunately, I can't claim that. I don't think even Rishi Sunak knew who's going to announce the election when we planned this event. But the timing is absolutely perfect, because what better time could there be to hear about what Ipsos's research says about public attitudes towards transport, how transport relates to the wider economy, to the environment, to issues around social inequality, and a whole set of other issues that we know are of great public concern. So what we're going to do is first start by asking Lizzie Kopp from Ipsos to present a really rich deck of information from Ipsos's polling over the last couple of years about transport and how it relates to the wider issues that I just touched on. I'm then going to ask Becca Massey-Chase from IPPR and Tom Cohen from the University of Westminster to respond briefly to what they've heard from Lizzie. And then we'll throw the event open to questions to Lizzie, Tom, and Becca. And you can post your questions in the chat, and Brogan, who's organised the event, will let me know what those questions are, and I'll sort of point questions at one or more of the panel as we go through. So we've got about an hour, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for engagement through Q&A. But let me start by introducing Lizzie, who is a research director in Ipsos UK Social Research Institute, where she heads up the Transport and Infrastructure Social Research and Policy Evaluation team. Lizzie's been involved in public opinion research for over a decade, about 12 years, and she designs and delivers research into people's travel behaviours and their attitudes towards transport. This often focuses on measuring and exploring changes in how we think about as well as how we use our transport systems, including how they think about future transport, technology change, decarbonisation and modal shift. And she's particularly interested in research methodologies and approaches which allow conversations with the public on complex and knotty topics, of which, of course, transport is a very good example. So without further ado, let me ask Lizzie to present what Ipsos knows about transport and public attitudes towards it. And then, as I say, I'll come to Tom and Becca to respond. Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And can I just check, can you hear me okay, and can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for dialing in to today's webinar. I'm really pleased to be here. As Ben mentioned, it's a super exciting time in the run-up to a general election. Ben also mentioned that I work at Ipsos UK in the Social Research Institute. So we do lots of political polling, lots of market research in Ipsos, but you may or may not know that we do lots of research with the public too. And I'm a social researcher sitting in our transport and infrastructure team. Today, I'm going to be giving you a quick roundup, as Ben mentioned, of Ipsos's in-house polling. So we work for lots of clients in the transport sector, but today's presentation is all of our in-house polling to give you the latest on where the public are at in their thinking at the moment, in particular on transport. So we'll start by looking at some background context, and then we'll move over specifically to transport and public opinion, and then we'll consider what next, and that hopefully will lead us into a nice discussion at the end. So time for change. What do the public think are the biggest issues facing the country today? This is a question that we ask every month on our political monitor. And we can see that right now, in the run up to the election, the NHS is up top, closely followed by inflation and the economy. This is not uncommon for things to be in these positions. And it's very important to say that things that are not on this list are not necessarily unimportant to people. This is just a relative list. So, for example, we've got the environment and climate change at the bottom. But if we ask about that in an absolute sense, It's not to say that this is not, not an issue at all to the public. We've got concern about climate change, for example, far outweighing those who say that they're not concerned about it. And if we zip over to the economy now, economic optimism, it has taken a small rise since last month. It's sitting at -4. That's up from -31 in April. It's actually quite rare to be in the positive with the net score for the economic optimism index. We are often gloomy as a nation about the economy, and obviously we're still in a cost of living crisis. So Rishi Sunak's had a small bounce with news about inflation not being to the extent it was, but it hasn't really recovered things for him. And I'm going to share some figures with you now from a global study, which shows that actually 4 in 10 of us think the rate of inflation will rise a lot or a little over the next year. That extends to over half of us saying that we expect our motoring fuel costs to rise in the next 6 months. We're below the global average for these figures, but for these ones on the right-hand side, we're actually above the global average for this study that was done in 33 countries. So nearly 4 in 10 of us think that the cost of living crisis has been worse than in neighbouring countries, and we in Britain are more likely than the global average to say that. And nearly 3/4 of us are blaming the government and its policies for contributing to Britain's cost of living. But we also think it's down to other things too. So actually roughly the same proportions say that they think that's down to the state of the global economy or big businesses making excessive profits. So that was a global study, but I'm zipping back over now to our political monitor with some figures here that show quite a gloomy mood again about public services. More people saying that it's got worse than on the other measures that we've taken for this going back to 2012. That's the past. What about the future and what we expect with public services and other things like the quality of the environment? We've still got greater proportions saying that this will get worse than get better. And you can see public transport down there, 44% saying over the next few years, we expect public transport to get worse. So where does that leave our leaders? Well, right now, for both Starmer and Sunak, they've got net negative satisfaction, and dissatisfaction with Sunak has been steadily increasing since he's taken position as Prime Minister, and it's been increasing among Conservative voters too. Keir Starmer's seen a little uptick since the locals, but nevertheless, he's 50% say that they're dissatisfied with the way that he is acting as leader of the Labour Party, and 8 in 10 of us are dissatisfied with the way that the government is running the country. So this is not transport related, obviously it's election related, but I thought I'd include it. This is where this leaves us this month with the vote share. If there was an election tomorrow, 41% are saying they vote Labour, 20% Conservative, and smaller proportions for the other parties there. So time for a change. That sentiment is stronger now than it's been over the last couple of years that we've pushed this statement to the public and asked for their view on it. 73% saying it's time for a change at the next election. And what do the public think that Keir Starmer should do if the Labour government are, if Labour is successful in the election? In the first 6 months, people are most likely to say that they think a Starmer's government's priorities should be improving the NHS. So obviously that reflects the issues index that we just saw. It's seen as an immediate priority, closely followed by the other top issues that we saw in the public's eyes, dealing with the economy, the cost of living. And we have got improving public transport on there, lower down the list, but nonetheless, it's not to say it's not a priority for people. If we ask the public about longer term priorities for Starmer's government, if Labour is successful, improving public transport goes up from 13th place to 10th place. And you can see actually improving the NHS has dropped right down there. So there's a sense among the public that needs to be dealt with quite urgently and quite quickly. And that's not, the NHS and healthcare, it is a voter issue. So it's not uncommon to see that ahead of an election. this is going to move us nicely over to what the public think about various aspects of transport. And we don't have time to look at every single transport mode, but I'll be looking in particular at rail, road and cycling. So first of all, I'm afraid it's more gloom and doom here, going back to what the public think is going to happen with public transport in the next few years. More people than we've seen historically on this trend line saying that they expect it to get worse. And you can see the direction that these results have gone in between 2020 and 2023. If we start by looking at rail, to think about what's top of mind for the public within transport in particular, 4 in 10 of us are saying that the quality of rail services in Britain is poor, outweighing the proportion who say it's good, and nearly as many of us expect the quality of rail services in Britain to get worse. 2 in 5 of us disagree with the statement that railways in Britain provide good value for money to passengers. And we've got disagreement being higher than agreement with actually all of these statements on the slide here. So again, it's looking a little negative for rail. Over 4 in 10 of us saying that we oppose the railway workers taking strike action. Not an insignificant proportion say that they support that, though, nearly a third at 32%. This fieldwork was done at the very beginning of the month. Obviously, we've had a lot of strike action since Christmas. In terms of what people think about Labour's proposed policy of nationalising passenger rail services, just over half say that we would support that. 13% oppose, and obviously the rest are either saying that they don't know or they give no views either way, which is perhaps not surprising given that the rail system is not totally unnationalised at the moment. Around half of us think that this idea of nationalisation would lead to a better quality of service. We're less likely to say that this would lead to reduced ticket prices. A little less likely than that to say fewer rail strikes. So nearly half of us agree with the statement, transport links in my local area are not good enough. Although 3 in 10 of us disagree with it. Who is most likely to agree with that statement? We do start to see some patterns here. People aged 55 to 64, people living in rural areas, and there will be some overlap there with those respondents in the survey, and people living in the areas and the nations that you can see, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Southwest, for example, and people with 2 or more cars or vans in the household. So if we move over to road then, here are some figures that we've run this month, and we also ran them in February 2022, so a couple of years ago. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's not really much change in attitudes for these statements here about car use and car ownership. So nearly 7 in 10 of us say that our current lifestyle means that we need a vehicle. And that includes quite a significant proportion, 40% saying that they strongly agree with that statement. Lots of us think there's too much traffic congestion in our area, though. We're going to zoom in on a couple of these statements again to see what's going on underneath that sort of sample average from the survey. So as I mentioned, 69% say that we think our lifestyle means we need a vehicle. And again, we've got people living in rural areas being among the most likely to say that. People in Wales, in the regions that you can see on the right-hand side there, and middle-aged and older age groups are more likely to say this too. So I think in terms of the conversations that we start having with the public about modal switch and that type of thing, this is worth bearing in mind. Who's most likely to think that there's too much traffic congestion in the local area? Yorkshire and the Humber has come up again, but also the southeast and people living in urban areas, as well as people aged 35 to 44. And there might be some overlap there between that age group and people who commute to work on the road, for example. So we're going to zip over to cycling now. Again, we've run these figures twice and we do see some small shifts actually. between 2022 and now. We've got 37% saying I'd like to cycle more than I currently do. That has dropped since 2022. And I think in terms of how we interpret that drop, we should be open-minded about why that might be. This is survey polling, so it's telling us the what, and that's what it's measuring, but it's not telling us why people are giving these responses. It might be, for example, that there was a bit of a post-pandemic bounce in appetite to cycle more than we currently do in 2022. And we've got just over 6 in 10 of us saying we think it's too dangerous for me personally to cycle on the roads, and about half of us saying I'm not the kind of person who rides a bicycle. So I'll zoom in on some subgroups again. Who's most likely to have appetite to cycle more than they currently do? People who identify as male, and those sort of younger into middle age groups, people in the southwest. Interestingly, people with children in the household and 2 cars or vans in the household, and people on higher incomes. Got nearly as many disagreeing with that statement as agreeing with it, which is interesting too. That's a bit of a split of opinion there. And what about those who are saying it's too dangerous for me to cycle on the roads? People who identify as female, older age groups, people living in rural areas in Northern Ireland with 2 cars or vans in the household. Okay, so that was a very quick whistle-stop tour of some public opinion going in on particular types of transport, but I'm going to move us forward now to start thinking about the future and some current and hypothetical transport policy options that we pose to the public in our survey work. So over half of us support the approaches that you can see on the slide here to help reduce emissions. And it's important to note that framing of the question. So we asked for support and opposition to all of these things to reduce the UK's carbon emissions. And like I say, for many of these, for walking and cycling instead of driving a car, we've got majority support for that. Perhaps that's not surprising. The little white arrows again are showing some drops since 2022. And I think it's quite important that we remember again that we don't know why people have given these responses. As I say, there might have been, when we did the survey in 2022, a bit of a post-pandemic kind of bounce, a bit of optimism about these things, which led to support levels being a bit higher. It may be that the public have just hardened slightly in their views of this stuff, bearing in mind the context that we've seen in the previous slides. There might be different reasons for each of these as to why support has dropped. I think it's important as well to remember that earlier slide about concern about climate change, and to not interpret this as, oh, the public just don't care about reducing the UK's carbon emissions, because the evidence doesn't really bear that out. For example, concern about climate change is still relatively high. So that's one thing to bear in mind when we look at the trend data for this. I'll move us on to some slightly different measures here, arguably slightly harder measures, so encouraging people to travel abroad less, as opposed to, for example, still doing that, but travelling a different way. So these ones are a little less about modal switch. We've got higher levels of opposition comparatively, lower levels of support. Likewise, support for road user charging has fallen in the years that we've measured public opinion on this. So I've put the exact wording that we've presented to the public on this, because I think views could differ depending on how it's framed. So this was framed as being designed to reduce traffic congestion and improve the local environment. Support is actually outweighed by opposition now for that. And opposition outweighs support for that one. And support has dropped even when we present this with different conditions attached. Interestingly, the one that hasn't fallen in terms of support is all revenues raised would be, if all revenues raised would be returned to the road user through lower road tax, but we've actually got comparatively higher opposition for that one. So I'm going to take my Ipsos hat off now and share some of my own personal views and reflections on this before we move on to hear other people's views as well. What do all of these findings mean, and how should we interpret this? I think, first of all, it appears from this data like there's quite a steep hill to climb. A lot of what I've presented looks quite gloomy. Transport obviously has bubbled up in political conversations over the last few months or the last year or so. It's not a top voter issue, though. It doesn't have the clout of the NHS. Obviously, it's still important to people, and there are positives. There is appetite for change, including change in the way that people travel among certain groups. So from a policy point of view, in terms of what we can do about that, we can kind of go in on those groups that are more likely to say they'd be keen to cycle more, for example. Or we could focus on allaying the concerns of the other groups, the people who are most likely to say that they think it's too dangerous to cycle on our roads. There are actions, positive actions that can be taken for this. The second point I wanted to make was that the decline in support for measures to reduce transport emissions that we just saw in the previous slide, that shouldn't be interpreted, as I said, as a lack of public concern about the environment or a lack of care about the environment. Other data would not support that. And we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. The public being less supportive of some green transport policy measures than they were 2 years ago, it doesn't mean that we don't want these improvements. A fall in support for green options, it's not the same as saying we don't want a better transport system. There is background noise, as we've seen in this data. The backdrop to this is a lot of public pessimism about the state of our public services, about the government, about the economy, and our personal finances. So it's not a foregone conclusion that the public oppose the types of measures which I've shown in the slides, and they were just a bunch of measures, of which there could be many more. This was just what we posed to the public in survey work. Support has outweighed opposition more strongly in the past for some of these things. So I think we can reframe this as, how do we get back to that? But context is really important, and we can't ignore, in whatever we do, we can't ignore the financial situation that households are in, because that's continuing to bite households at the moment. The public are also not completely uniform. So obviously what I've presented today is a bunch of sample averages from surveys. I've pulled out some subgroups, but even within those subgroups, people are diverse and very, very different within that. So different approaches will speak to different groups, different subgroups, different groups within the subgroups. And so we need to make sure that we're alive to that diversity. People have messy, complicated lives, and transport and how they use it will absolutely follow through that. Finally, then, framing of all of these things is important. And we can talk about switches and shifts rather than binary change, switches and shifts in journeys where it's possible for people to make those changes. Harder measures we need to package more carefully so that they're not seen as kind of binary, one or the other. I don't think that we'd ever be aiming for 100% of the population to be cycling around, for example. It's really important that the public don't see it as a binary thing or something, policy changes that are imposed on them or taking away their freedoms and liberties, for example. So everything that I presented today has come from survey quantitative research, but certainly that's a concern that we sometimes hear in qualitative research and engagement with the public. It's the idea of having freedoms taken away. So that's just to say that framing, as we know, is important. So that's it from me. And I think we're going to open up a discussion now. And it looks like some questions have come through in the chat.
Lizzie, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. A real cornucopia of data there. So just before I come to Becca and Tom, just a couple of, I guess, kind of method questions that people have asked. One is you mentioned there's some geographical differences in the responses you got from this polling. Do we know anything specifically about the difference between London and other parts of the country, given the particular circumstances in London? A question that Daniel Smith's asked. And then another question around method, which is what does rail mean in the survey? You may not know the answer to this question. Is it national rail, or does it include regional and local rail services as well? So what rail service are people being asked about when they're asked that question? So just say that London versus non-London, and then what is rail when people are asked about it?
Yep. So on the regional differences, I've just picked out differences where I've seen statistically significant ones, and there were some differences with the southeast. On the rail wording, it would include local services as well as national, but how it was presented to the public in the survey really just was as you saw the wording in grey on the slides. But I think that's a really important question because it does highlight that people can be thinking of slightly different things when they answer questions. So we try to be as clear as possible. But we know that opinion might differ on those things.
So lots of really interesting data there. So people are generally quite pessimistic about life, the state of the economy. They're a bit skeptical about government, both political parties. Um, and also, we shouldn't sort of draw, nonetheless, too many kind of gloomy conclusions, because clearly there is no such thing as the public. There are lots and lots of different publics with subcategories of by age, by geography, by income, by household type, and so on and so forth. And that we shouldn't regard some of these responses that mean that people aren't concerned about transport or wouldn't like a better transport system, and indeed more specifically aren't concerned about the environment and climate in particular. And a lot of this is about how you kind of frame these questions and understanding the different responses that people have depending on who they are and their circumstances. Fantastic. So let me ask firstly Becca Natty Chase to just give some sort of top of mind thoughts in response to what you just heard from Lizzie. Becca is a principal research fellow and co-head of participative research at the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. Formerly, she was co-deputy head of the Environmental Justice Commission, looking at how we can use citizens' juries across the UK to engage the public in important and complex policy questions like this one. And she now leads the IPP's work on developing and using participatory methods and deliberative democracy to co-create policy solutions. So Becca, just what your kind of immediate thoughts are on what we just heard from Lizzie in terms of transport and what people think about it.
Of course, brilliant. Thank you so much, Lizzie, for a really interesting presentation and lots that resonated with the research that we've done. So that's always good and reassuring. And I think, yes, I think I have sort of three reflections really. The first, just to kind of reflect a little bit about sort of how our research is similar, or we found sort of similar findings, or findings that might complement yours, is that public transport is hugely valued. That's something that we've found in our research. And I, as sort of Ben said in the introduction, I work on participative research across the institute. So I get the pleasure of going along to events that aren't about public transport, aren't about transport. They might be about social integration in Yorkshire or about levelling up in Stoke-on-Trent. And every single time I go to one of those and I talk to people, people talk about buses. I don't think I've ever been to a workshop where people haven't talked about buses, even if that's not what we're there to talk about. It is so important to people. And when you start to have those conversations about what they value and what's important to their life, even if it's not important for them, they see that it's important for somebody else. And it fills you with hope as well, I think, when you hear people talking like that. So we know it's really important, and we also know from some recent research that we've done, a recent national survey that we did around Christmas time, that it's not just really valued, it's seen as a necessity, and it's seen as a necessity by people who are car owners as well. So all of that, I think, really resonates, and that people want to use it more. So a third of the people that we surveyed said that they want to use public transport more. So it's something that's important to people for all sorts of reasons. And there's a very sort of strong kind of uniting thing around the people's belief and value of public transport, which is great to hear. I agree absolutely that concern about climate is really high, and is really important to recognise that when people have maybe some scepticism about some of the policies for decarbonising transport, that's not rooted in a lack of concern about climate. So we've just done this research where we looked at people's responses in this survey by sort of a bit more audience segmentation. So some people may be familiar with Britain Talks Climate and the segmentation that they use. So it's 7 segments across Britain, ranging from progressive activists who are potentially kind of very politically active and for whom climate change is central to their identity, to backbone conservatives who are patriotic and proud of Britain's environmental achievements, but they're dismissive of virtue signalling. They're different groupings, and I can talk more about that in a little bit. But I reinforce that, as Lizzie said, all of those people care about climate, all of them care about the environment, but why they care about it might differ, and the values that underpin that might differ. And when we think about our transport sort of policy stuff, then actually recognising what are those underpinning values that affect how people feel can be really important when it comes to that framing, when it comes to those conversations about transport policies. But I think it's always really important to recognise how high concern for climate change really is, and that when anybody tries to turn it into a culture war issue, they're way off the mark. And then just finally, just a reflection on that sort of more negative perception about public expectations about the sort of maybe more depressing future ahead on public services and public transport, and just a complementary finding maybe from some of our recent research about the sort of low trust environment that we're in the moment around politics, and that pessimism might be rooted in people's anxiety about who makes decisions and who makes decisions that affect them. And certainly that we found that over half of the people that we surveyed in this recent piece of research said that politicians have a bad understanding of what transport looks like in areas like mine. 63% said that they feel that they have little say over transport decisions. A third said they have no say, and that was, I think, higher in rural areas than it was in other places. So when we're thinking about why people might be feeling negative or depressed about that future ahead, that actually a good place to start the conversation might be about where decisions get made and who gets to make those decisions. So those are some initial reflections from me on that really interesting presentation, Lily, but looking forward to talking more.
Becca, fantastic. So 3 things. One is whatever the topic you're talking about with your colleagues, public transport in general and buses in particular always comes up. So it's clearly it's top of mind in people's lives. Secondly, climate concern is an issue. It exists, is significant, but why people are concerned about climate will vary by who they are, as we've heard, because obviously not everyone is the same. And thirdly, something very important about the pessimism in public minds. It may actually be about sort of how government works and whether they're properly involved in decisions that affect them every day. Who are the decision makers? Are they taking my interest into account? Really interesting. Thank you very much. So we'll come back in a minute to further questions and comment for sure. So the third speaker today is Tom Cohen. Tom is a reader in transport policy at University of Westminster and a member of its Active Travel Academy. And like the other 2 speakers today, he has a long-standing interest in democratizing transport and how people get involved in decisions and discussions about the transport that affects them, with a particular emphasis on what he calls deliberation, with a particular focus again on active travel. So Tom, what your kind of top of mind thoughts in response to Lizzie's presentation and what you also heard from Becca?
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity. That was a really interesting set of slides from Lizzie. And maybe I'll start, as a researcher might, by saying that when you see a presentation like that, you immediately want to know what were people thinking as they gave their answers. There's so much there that is unsaid. And so I would default to the focus group and other deliberative methods to get under the skin of some of that stuff, because it seems to generate almost more questions than it answers. But on the specifics, I'll start with pessimism, since there's plenty of it about, and a very strong sense that I get that it infuses everything that we've heard, that there's a sense in which pessimism begets pessimism. So we've been told that things have been bad for a while, and I think that's bound to influence people's perceptions concerning the future. And I think that explains a lot of the answers that we get. And perhaps it even extends to why people are less enthusiastic about encouraging mode shift than they would have been a couple of years ago. And this is ironic, really, because encouragement on the face of it seems to hurt no one. It's not a stick. It's not taking your car away. It's about improving the options for those who might be amenable to making a change. But support for all of those things has dropped. And I see that as being due to this general sense of things being hard. I hope I'm right in that, because I can't reconcile myself to the idea that people are actively opposed to encouragement as a general theme. More specifically, I guess there's some interesting thoughts in there. If 54% of people think there's too much congestion, then that would seem to imply that 46% find it at least tolerable. And now that's interesting, because we hear about congestion a lot in terms of the transport policy debate. Sometimes it's the most prominent issue as far as the media are concerned. And so whilst obviously 54% is a worrying number, the flip side of 46% is perhaps something that we can take some comfort from. And I suppose there's no one who's saying that there's too little congestion in their area, but I suppose that's a possible subtext. But there's an interesting mismatch, actually, when you look beneath the numbers, between the incidence of actual congestion at a regional level and people's attitudes to it. So if you look at Department for Transport figures, for example, people are very critical of congestion in the northeast, and yet, objectively speaking, it's really not very extensive compared with places such as London. So there's some really interesting perception issues going on there. And I suppose that leads quite naturally into a discussion of cycling, which you would expect from me, seeing as I'm of the Active Travel Academy. So a couple of statistics seem to have gone down. The perception that it's too dangerous to cycle has dropped. The first thing to say about that is that the Department for Transport asks that same question in their attitudinal surveys, and many on the call may know that a very large proportion of regular cyclists consider it to be too dangerous to cycle on the roads. So there's a sense in which they feel the fear and they do it anyway. And I suppose that's something for us to bear in mind. The perception that it's too dangerous to cycle doesn't mean that it's actually beyond belief that they might. It may still happen, despite the belief that it should be a great deal safer than it is. And it's interesting that that number has fallen at the same time as people who say that they would like to cycle more than they currently do has fallen. Again, I think I'd want to get into a focus group in order to unpick that. Why is it that those two things, which really ought to be in opposition, seem to be moving together? And a final point connected with this is, again, a decrease in agreement with the statement that the council should be doing more to encourage cycling in my local area. Now, my suspicion is fairly clear that that's because people consider that to be relatively a lower priority than it was when the question was last asked. And that would seem to go back to my earlier points about pessimism. But I suppose it's just conceivable, though not very likely, that people are saying that they agree less with that statement because they perceive the council as having done more lately to encourage cycling, such that the situation is better than it was. Maybe that's one for us to ponder further.
Tom, brilliant. Thank you. So some questions there about sort of the general pessimism that's prevailing seems to be in what, and the sense that doing difficult things is just more difficult than it might have been in the past. And how do we frame this in terms of positive encouragement? And a sort of underlying question, which I might come back to Lizzie in a second, about sort of understanding what's really going on in people's minds when they're answering these quite specific questions, obviously in polling exercises, and how you kind of get under the skin of that. Great. So I'd like to start with a question imbued in my role as chair for all three of you, which is, I was struck, Lizzie, by in your two charts showing where improving public transport ranks relative to other public concerns. That if you think about the role of transport in society, it's clearly fundamentally important for many of the other things on the list that are higher up in terms of people concerned. So improving education and skills and access to learning, dealing with the cost of living, growing the economy, building more homes, dealing with climate, tackling inequality. So I guess my question for all three of you is, to what extent is this an issue around how we frame transport in relation to its role in supporting people's wider lives? And you mentioned, Lizzie, that that Becca mentioned that buses always come up in conversations about almost any other topic. So is there a question here about how we as transport planners frame transport as an enabler, as a means of providing access to other things like work, poverty alleviation? Because if we just talk about it in terms of transport, then people may sort of think of it in a bucket over on one side. So just, is this a framing issue? And if so, how can we frame the issues around transport in a way which connects them more explicitly to these other concerns that people seem to be worried about? Lizzie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can only agree with those points. And when we think historically, transport hasn't necessarily been talked about as a singular public service, because it's not. If we go right back, transport hasn't been talked about, for example, as part of the welfare state, which perhaps it could be. That's a social policy conversation. It's not, the discourse isn't the same as when we talk about kind of big public services like health and education. And it is a bit messy because we're talking about lots of different transport modes. It's not one thing, put simply. So, yeah, personally, I think a reframing about transport as an enabler of social mobility and opportunity, as well as economic goods and environmental goods, would be a really great way to frame it. That's a personal view.
Great, thank you. Becca, same question to you then. So you mentioned in your response that obviously buses come up just almost whatever the topic is, health, housing, poverty. What's your sense of how we could frame the transport issue more overtly, so it was kind of connected in people's minds to these broader goals and concerns that they have about their lives and the lives of their communities?
I think when you sort of put the question, the first thing I thought is, we're all transport people here, and I wonder, is it that we want that transport to go up that list? Is that actually the ambition that we have? Or is it more that we want to connect transport to the things that are higher above it on the list more explicitly? Because higher above it is tackling inequality. And I don't think I'd want to see that go down. I don't think I'd want to see some of the things that are above it be lower on the list than they are. But when you make those explicit connections, I think that's really important. And sometimes even the word transport can be a bit of a barrier because it just immediately makes people think of something particular in their life potentially, or it makes them think of vehicles. It doesn't necessarily make them think of what they do as a pedestrian, for example. So there's all sorts of things in there, and I think depending on the situation will probably affect how you want to go about that, and the narrative and the sort of words that you use, whether you're talking about how we get around or things like that. There's sort of different language tweaks that you might use in different situations, but I absolutely think that yes, it's sort of transport is underrepresented in some of the conversations where it could be really important as a crucial lever to achieving some of those social health environmental goals, and how it gets brought into those conversations I think is really important, and a much more kind of holistic approach where transport is factored in to those conversations would be really helpful.
Great, thank you. And Tom, same question to you. So obviously you're interested in deliberative processes. Is there a challenge here for us as transport professionals about the fact that we're quite interested in transport and sometimes may not connect it in people's minds overtly enough to the other things that affect their quality of their life and their life circumstances?
Sure. Well, yes, as a transport person, I frequently find myself feeling offended that other people are not as fascinated by it as I am. But we can only hope that they will one day come around. I think the first thing we have to say is that we social researchers are guilty of sometimes failing to acknowledge quite how abstract what we do is. We're asking people questions that they're not generally asked, that aren't at top of mind. And so we shouldn't be too surprised when the answers that come back are a bit odd or difficult to reconcile. More specifically, there's certainly something to be said for starting the conversation elsewhere. So if for the sake of argument, you're having a conversation with members of a community, you could say to them, well, what should we do about the traffic around here? And the conversation will go off in a particular direction. If you say to them instead, what kind of a place do we want this to be? The conversation will tend to be entirely different. And transport will inevitably come up, but it will come up in a secondary way after people have first acknowledged that, well, they want to live in a nice area, which is quiet and pleasant and so forth. So we certainly have a responsibility as practitioners to be alive to that and to acknowledge first that framing is inevitable. You can't pursue any of this without a frame, but to be very frame aware, if I can use that expression, and perhaps even to experiment with different framings to see what that does to the nature of the questions and the nature of the answers that come back to your questions.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute. Great. All right, that's fantastic. Thank you. So let's come to questions from the audience. There are a couple of questions here, one from Tom Sansom and one from Alec Greatholder, which really relate to the extent to which people are thinking about their own transport and travel patterns and behaviours as opposed to other people. So Alex asked, to what extent do we have insight into the level of support for change from the public for the purpose of helping other people's travel? And similarly, Tom asked, it's fair to say that there's more support for other people changing their behaviour than people changing their own behaviour. So let's just quickly ask three of you in turn. Lizzie, to what extent is it possible to determine whether people are more willing for other people to change their behavior? So, for example, one of the statistics was around people not regarding their own car as important and also being concerned about congestion in the neighborhood. Of course, congestion is obviously caused by other people, not them. So, to what extent is it possible to understand how people are thinking about this in terms of their own behavior as opposed to the need for other people to change their behavior?
Yeah, I do think previous research has shown that people like the idea of encouraging people, everyone else, or all of us to walk or cycle more. But when you ask about you personally, that's a bit different. That doesn't necessarily mean that people themselves are going to do that. Sorry, what was the second half of the question?
How can we sort of get people to think about their own behaviour as opposed to assuming that it's somebody else to sort out the transport problem? You know, for example, congestion is somebody else causing it. My car's important, theirs isn't.
Right. Yeah, I think tapping into different levers for different people would be a really interesting idea in that. And Tom, you've mentioned doing much more in-depth research with the public, and I think sort of testing that and working out what would motivate people to change, what works for different types of people. For some people, knowing their carbon footprint of their travel in quite an obvious, immediate way might be really, really powerful. But for other people, it might be more about money saving. So I think there's a lot that could be played with there. I don't think that quite answers your question, but those are my thoughts.
That's fine. Okay. Tom, to you. So this is transport problems being caused to me are sort of somebody else's responsibility. To what extent can we how could we bring these challenges back to people so that they understand that this is partly about what they do as well as what other people do in terms of making transport circumstances better?
Well, I think we're probably talking about a fairly major social project, which is to foster altruism and selflessness. And we can all carry on with that noble enterprise. I think for the time being, at least, the way transport is packaged and the way it's perceived is it's about serving one's own interests. I lead a module on behavior change, and the sorts of things that we talk about tend to relate to making the target behavior desirable for the target audience, not making them think, well, if I cycle, I'll be taking one for the team, having an unpleasant time, but benefiting the environment and my fellow humans. That doesn't really play. And more generally, the environmental messages don't seem to perform anything like as well in terms of encouraging behavior change as personal benefit, be that financial, time, or health. Should we criticize and condemn our fellow humans for that? No, I don't think we should, and I don't think we can. I think what that tells us is that if we are going to promote significant behavior change, it's not going to be through encouraging a degree of philanthropy, which we have not so far seen amongst our species.
So, Becca, we're hearing from Tom that mass outbreak of altruism is probably unrealistic to expect and may not actually be effective. So, how could we, perhaps change my question slightly, how could we frame people changing their travel behavior in ways that sound beneficial to them? To what extent is your work, for example, through public participation deliberation, suggested ways that we can frame this again so that it sounds like it's beneficial for them to change their own behavior? How possible is that?
I think it is definitely possible. I think I'd take a step back though, and say actually not everybody needs to change their own behaviour as much across the board as some other people do. So the burden of responsibility doesn't fall evenly across everybody. And actually, when we go to these deliberative events, one of the things that we hear time and time again is that people who can do more should do more. So when we're thinking about that kind of us and them, and is it my responsibility, is it other people's responsibility? Actually, one of the messages is not just general other of people that should change, it's specific other. So we've got some research out today. Half of all transport emissions in Britain come from just 1 in 5 people. People with an income over 100k travel at least double the distance each year of those earning under 30k. So actually, when people say they want people who can do more to do more, there's a real potential for that to happen. And so I think sort of taking that step back at that kind of us and them, there's something specific in that that's worth bearing in mind. But absolutely, sort of, taking that to one side, people don't necessarily see their themselves as part of a problem, and we've heard that in we did an event in Scotland looking at reducing car use in Scottish cities. And I remember a participant turning around and through the conversation suddenly saying, oh, I've just realised that my car is part of the traffic. It's not ever crossed my mind before. So there are those sorts of conversations. And I'd love it if we did more and more of these sorts of deliberative events and involve more and more people in these sorts of conversations, because I think that's how people go on that kind of journey, by listening to other people and hearing their perspectives and seeing the evidence and having the opportunity to appraise it. So opportunities to participate in those sorts of things, I think, is one way. Obviously, you can't have everybody doing it, but I think that can be a really meaningful exercise. But yes, absolutely, framing around benefits to them. People's sort of health benefits and things like that is always helpful and always important. But there's actually a lot to unpack. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this particular challenge.
Perhaps time for one more question for the three of you. So you may be aware that Glenn Lyons, the academic at UWE, has just published the Triple Access Planning Handbook, where Glenn has been developing the idea for a while that we ought to be thinking in transport terms about access rather than mobility, as we've just been discussing, that transport is one enabler for achieving access to goods, services, and opportunities, to work, to leisure, to education, to other people. And I wonder again, I guess it's a framing question again for each of you, starting with you, Lizzie. To what extent would framing the question around transport in terms of it being a means of achieving access alongside digital connectivity and increasing proximity through spatial planning, again, which means we're not talking exclusively about transport mobility. To what extent do you think that approach, the triple access planning approach, is helpful in terms of sort of framing how people think about transport and the role it plays in their lives?
Yeah, I think describing the means as well as the ends is really important. But to turn it on its head, talking about the end still needs to be part of the conversation with the public. So that's a little bit of an abstract thing to say, but to give an example, in qualitative research, when we talk with members of the public about aspects of transport and perhaps safety, perhaps road safety, if something is framed as being a means to improving safety, that's quite powerful. That's an end, regardless of the means. Whereas perhaps in some contexts it might be less powerful to talk about the environment as the end. So, providing to access to things, yes, but what is it all for? It still needs to be part of the conversation, I think. And that kind of just takes us back to the discussion that we just had about people will think about, all of us naturally will think about what is all of this for me personally.
Great, thank you. Tom, same question to you. Is triple access planning potentially one way of thinking about this issue and presenting it to people differently and more positively so that they're thinking about transport as one means to a set of ends rather than just an end in itself?
Broadly, yes. I think, as we've already identified, it's impossible to isolate transport, and it's not terribly helpful to isolate transport because it's a means to an end. The challenge comes in drawing boundaries around the discussion so that you can actually have a constructive conversation that doesn't just become unmanageably wide-ranging. Ultimately, we're always talking about the same thing, aren't we? Which is quality of life or well-being, and the various ways in which that can be influenced by how much money you earn and what kind of environment you inhabit and so on. But if you can start with a general conversation about quality of life and then start moving towards the places we inhabit and the services we require, you can imagine that transport will eventually pop out at some point, or it'll pop up maybe at various points during the conversation. That is a messy way of doing research, one that I wouldn't necessarily shrink from, but I can imagine that plenty of us transport researchers might think, well, okay, but can I be confident that I will have something reportable out the end of it? As an academic, I live in the privileged position of not having to worry quite so much about keeping a client happy, but I can see how there is an appetite for crisp answers to crisp questions. Well, so there is every likelihood that we will continue to return to these somewhat more circumscribed ways of thinking about the issues.
Great. And then finally, Becca, for you, same question. Would a kind of access means to an end framing help? And to what extent? And is that the direction we should be moving in terms of how we talk about this agenda?
Yeah, I think I'd just briefly say that I think that is already how the public often think, and that we hear the language of access and people talking about being able to access, even if they're not using that exact word, but certainly that's the sort of intention. It's already really embedded in the way that people are thinking and talking about transport, I think. So a good way in.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm going to very unfairly ask you one final question, which is sort of question people hate getting at the last minute. If there was one thing you wanted from each of you from the parties competing for our votes in the forthcoming election in relation to transport and more sustainable transport, what would you want them to say about their commitments around transport in their campaigning over the next 4 to 6 weeks? Lizzie, I'm going to start with you. What one thing would you want to hear from the main political parties about transport to move us to a more sustainable system?
I'd like to hear a shift away from the war on the motorist kind of culture wars narrative, because a personal opinion is that isn't helpful, and some things have become wrapped up in that. So just something totally fresh from that.
Very good. Tom, same question for you. What one thing do you want from our national politicians in this debate to move the debate forward?
Well, provided I'm allowed not to be realistic, then I will make my wish that any incoming party would commit to very significant car restraint.
Very good. And then finally, Becca, what's your prescription for our national politicians?
I mean, it's very tricky to choose just one, which means I think I would go for an overarching one, which is that there needs to be a new transport strategy that sets out the goals that the transport system should be working towards, and that should then frame our transport decision making. That should then that should affect how we make all of our other transport decisions. So what is transport for being the driving decision at the top.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. I'm conscious there are lots and lots of questions in the chat we haven't had a chance to get to. I'm sure we could go on with this conversation the whole afternoon if people didn't have other things to do. But we are unfortunately at time, just before 1 o'clock. So we ought to give people a chance to go back to what else they need to do. Can I thank very much indeed Lizzie for her presentation that opened it up in such an interesting way, and to Becca and Tom for their contributions and comments and observations. Thank you very much to Brogan McPherson, Ruby Stringer, and Mark Frost for organising the event. Thank you to all of you for coming along and posing your questions in the chat. And I'm sorry we didn't get to as many of them as I would have liked. So just to kind of conclude for me, what I've heard is that this is a complex issue. We are both pessimistic and optimistic. We want change, both in terms of national politics, but also transport in particular, that people see transport as important as it connects to the rest of their lives, and that we have to frame the questions around transport in the right way to get the right sorts of rich responses that we need from members of the public who all have different views for different reasons. Finally, to close by saying, if you're not a member of the Transport Planning Society, I hope you've enjoyed today's event and that you will now join up urgently to support us in our work. And thank you again to everyone for their time and their contributions to today's event. It's been absolutely fantastic. Have a great afternoon.